Now, where you decide when to sleep and when to rise, every moment of her day was planned, examined, judged. It's hard to imagine that level of constant scrutiny, like living in a museum where you're also an exhibit. That winter, the Marlboroughs journeyed to Russia, drawn by the grandeur of a court that glittered like legend and trembled like warning. St. Petersburg shimmered with snow and suspicion. The streets were wide but windswept, the palaces imposing but hollow. At first glance, it was splendor. At second, strain. At the Winter Palace, Consuelo wore white satin. Her tiara flashed beneath chandeliers. Scarlet footmen stood, sentinel. Mazurkas began. Grand Duke Michael took her hand and laughed when she stumbled. "Never mind," he said. "I'll do the steps." He would be executed 16 years later. At another supper, her seat was left empty. When the Tsar arrived, he filled it. "Russia is not ready for democracy," he told her softly. "We are 200 years behind Europe." He feared his ministers, feared the people, feared giving power long enough for anyone to become dangerous. Then he smiled gently at her with a wink. "I know everything you've done in Russia. The secret police send me reports." Behind the charm, the system watched. At the Hermitage, supper was served among Van Dycks and saints under flickering candlelight. A familiar tune played, Malbrook s'en va en guerre. The Tsar smiled. She smiled back, but unease stirred. Versailles again, she thought. Everything glittered, nothing breathed. Then, in 1903, they were invited to India. Lord Curzon staged the Delhi Durbar like an imperial opera. Gun salutes, gilded elephants, guards, and golden sashes. A palace of tents shimmered in the dust. Each one had its own salon, its own bath, but privacy was fiction. At the Great Ball, Lady Curzon wore a gown embroidered with peacock feathers. They whispered it was bad luck. She died not long after. Consuelo waved to cheering crowds. She smiled in unbearable heat. She dined in splendour while famine-starved children watched from behind palace walls. She had been taught that empire was stability, but now she saw only shadows in the sun. Even the crowns, she wrote, were copies of something lost. At the Purda party, she met Indian princesses behind embroidered screens, luminous, poised, painted like miniatures. But to Consuelo, they felt like butterflies, beautiful, still unable to fly. One morning she joined a falcon hunt at dawn. The sun rose over the plains. The birds soared, unhooded, circling. One could dive at 150 miles per hour. One had flown from Fontainebleau to Malta in a single day. But what she remembered most was this. From a minaret she looked down into darkness. A single firework burst, and beneath it a sea of upturned faces, turbans of every shade, eyes gleaming. Not joy, it was rapture. Then on to Vienna. The city still glittered with operettas and empire. Introduced by Count Mensdorff, Consuelo entered easily. She met Emperor Franz Joseph, small, grave, heavy with grief. On Maundy Thursday, she watched him wash the feet of 12 poor men. The archdukes laid out food. It was whisked away. The gesture remained. The soul was gone. She visited the Spanish riding school, watched a groom catch a horse's waist midair so it wouldn't touch the floor. The Viennese laughed. She did too, but she could no longer hear the music. Her hearing had begun to vanish. Not all at once, but like a ballroom filling with fog. The world had not gone silent. It had simply stopped, including her. Vienna, she thought, was a stage. The rituals survived, but the meaning had drained away. When John Singer Sargent arrived at Blenheim to paint her, he was brisk, fidgeting, always smoking. He refused to let her wear pearls, called her neck a tree trunk. Her dress was ivory satin, her posture impeccable. The boys stood beside her. The Duke wore his garter robes. Sargent worked quickly. He didn't need revision. "He captured me beautifully," she said, "but he did not find me." When the portrait was hung in the Great Hall, she looked at it the same way others did, from the outside. She returned to England with letters to answer and public events to attend. She did so perfectly. There were no scandals, no refusals. The Duchess was always present, always framed just right, but her voice had softened, her step had slowed. She was no longer performing for love or even approval, only for the preservation of the story being told around her. "I was still called the Duchess," she would write, "but I had already become someone else." Consuelo and Sonny had been married 11 years. Time hadn't softened their differences. It had sharpened them. The quiet war between two mismatched souls, bound by rank and ritual, had run its course. Divorce was almost unthinkable in Edwardian England. A man needed only proof of adultery. A woman required abandonment, violence, or disgrace. And yet, in 1906, they separated. There was no quarrel, no final scene, just a letter left on her writing desk at Sunderland House. "I believe it is time we consider a formal arrangement." There was no cruelty in it, no insult, just the familiar hand of the Duke, measured, precise, and impersonal. The formal end to a marriage that had long since dissolved. Consuelo did not weep. She did not pace the room. She stood at the window overlooking Grosvenor Square and watched the light fall across the pavement as a nursemaid walked 2 children toward the park. There was no rupture, she would write later, only a removal, as if a painting had been taken down from a wall, leaving the outline faintly visible behind it. Her fingers curled around the curtain. The fire had not been lit. Her breakfast tray did not come. She'd sent the staff away for the morning. For the first time in years, she chose the quiet. She did not cry. She simply took down the small wedding portrait on her mantel, framed in tortoise shell, posed to perfection, and placed it in a drawer face down. This was not the end of her life. It was merely the beginning. In London, Consuelo's Fridays began to gather those who needed no invitation and bowed to no titles. George Bernard Shaw brought wine. Galsworthy brought opinions. The Webbs came with pamphlets. Yeats with questions. Nancy Astor asked her questions with an eyebrow raised. Lady Cunard arrived with a laugh too loud for her pearls. There were no place cards, no orchestra, no agenda, but conversation. They argued about suffrage and socialism, Irish verse and industrial reform. No one asked about the Duke. No one mentioned Blenheim. They addressed her as Consuelo. Not your Grace, not Madam, just her name. Once, after midnight, as the last guest slipped into the fog, she stood by the empty decanter in the low firelight and thought, "This is what society should feel like, not ceremony, but belonging." Though the court refused to receive separated women, London society came. It was not rebellion, but grace under pressure. But as the music faded and the last applause died, the halls grew quiet again. The children were sent to school. The letters slowed. The echo of the evening lingered, but it was not enough. Not anymore. She had stood on the staircase. Now she needed to climb higher into work that mattered. She found it in Ensley Street. The house smelled of coal, starch, and damp wood. It was a home for the wives of first offenders, women whose husbands had been sent to prison, leaving them behind with children and shame. The church army called it a refuge. Most simply called it temporary. She had come expecting to observe. Instead, a baby was placed in her arms. "He hasn't cried since last week," said one of the matrons, "but he won't sleep either." The child's skin was warm and dry, his limbs stiff. He blinked but did not fuss. She rocked him carefully, awkwardly conscious of her gloves. Consuelo visited the next week, then the week after that. She leased 2 houses. She turned them into sewing rooms, nurseries. The women worked. Their children were cared for. At night, she read them prayers. "We like the Duchess to read to us," one said, "but she always makes us cry." Some clergy approved. Others whispered that she had gone too far, stepping beyond the ornamental bounds of charity into something unsettlingly real. She ignored them. "Mrs. Bellingham, is it true that you once lived in a palace?" a little girl with matchstick arms asked her one evening as she buttoned the child's nightgown. "I did," Consuelo replied. "Was it like in the fairy stories, with golden carriages and servants who bring you anything you want?" Consuelo paused, remembering the cold marble floors, the endless corridors, the silences. "Not quite like the stories," she said. "Sometimes the most beautiful cages are the ones with the strongest bars." The child frowned, not understanding. "Do the princes in the stories ever ask the princesses what they want?" Consuelo asked. The little girl thought hard. "I don't think so." "Exactly," Consuelo smiled. "Real happiness isn't about having someone bring you things. It's about being asked what you want." From charity, she turned to policy. She joined the National Commission on the Declining Birth Rate, the only laywoman among doctors, priests, economists, and eugenicists. Consuelo did not flinch. Beside her sat Dr. Marie Stopes, scandalous, brilliant, unafraid. Her book silenced pulpits. Consuelo sat at the end of the table, perfectly upright, gloved hands folded in her lap. When called upon, she spoke quietly but without hesitation. She described overcrowded tenements, malnourished infants, mothers with no access to medical care. She quoted midwives, school inspectors, and women she had met in the homes. One of the men scoffed. Another, a clergyman known as the Gloomy Dean, frowned. But then Marie Stopes stood. "I believe," she said, "that the Duchess of Marlborough is the only person here speaking from lived truth rather than abstract morality." There was no applause, only silence. Later in her diary, Consuelo wrote, "I had never expected to be heard, only to be counted. Today I was both." By 1907, the press had given her a name, the Working Duchess. At first it felt pointed, almost mocking, but over time it became accurate. If not warm, then at least true. Across the Atlantic, her mother began to write again. Not commands, not corrections, but reflections. "You are becoming what I could not," Alva wrote. "I admire you for it." There was no apology, but something in the spacing of the words felt like release to Consuelo. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where she had once kept a silver rattle, an ivory fan, and a letter that had set her free. They exchanged news of suffrage speeches and playground campaigns, of prison mothers and Westminster bills. Alva described women chained to iron railings in front of the Capitol. Consuelo wrote of women sewing in silence behind Ensley doors. They were not close, but now they were aligned. In 1908, Consuelo returned to America to give her first public speech for children's needs at the Waldorf Astoria. 700 guests filled the ballroom. Colonel George Harvey urged her forward. She had dreaded it, but duty outweighed fear. She had been announced as a duchess. The crowd expected aristocratic pleasantries. Instead, she spoke of Ensley Street, of cracked teacups, overcrowded lodgings, and mothers who fed their children tea to quiet their hunger. She spoke slowly, her voice low at first, then steadier, firmer. "Dignity is not conferred by title," she said. "It is sustained by recognition." There was a moment's hush at the end, then applause, scattered, then rising, until the room was full of hands and sound. Her marriage had ended, but the silence she'd endured had taught her how to listen, and now she used it to make others heard. She had once been part of a story, now she was beginning to write one. In November 1913, Sunderland House opened its doors to a carefully selected guest list. Bishops in stiff collars, politicians with polished shoes, society women balancing lorgnettes and expectations. They arrived expecting tea and conversation, a graceful morning's nod to charity. What they encountered was something else entirely. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, had summoned them not to flatter, but to confront. With Margaret Lawrence and Gertrude Tuckwell beside her, she presided over a conference designed not to comfort but to expose. One by one, 12 working women took the stage. A shirtmaker held up a blouse, her fingers tight around the cloth. "A dozen shirts earns 9p," she said. Another spoke, voice clear and unflinching. 8 shillings a week. I've never eaten a dinner that cost more than a penny." No one spoke, no one smiled, and no one, not even the industrialists in the back row, could look away. By the end of the week, 8 additional trades had received legal protection. It was not a riot. It was not a headline. It was something quieter and more subversive. The truth, spoken in the language of suffering, echoing through rooms of carved marble. For Consuelo, it was a moment of clarity and collapse. After a speech in Liverpool, she rode the train home in silence. Her limbs ached, her breath came shallow, a hot water bottle warmed her feet, but still she shook, and as the countryside slipped past in dusk and fog, her thoughts turned inevitably to her mother. Alva Vanderbilt, once her tormentor, had changed. Widowhood had not softened her, but redirected her. Alva had hurled herself into the suffrage movement with the same force she had once used to mould a debutante's spine. But this time, the ambition was not personal. It was political. She marched, she funded, she organised, and remarkably, she invited Consuelo not as pupil, but as partner. Through her, Consuelo met the women who led the charge. Emmeline Pankhurst, fierce beneath lace and bone. Christabel, fire-tongued and defiant. Dr. Anna Shaw, who had once delivered babies and sermons with equal authority. These women had suffered. Some had starved, some had bled, and none begged permission. One letter from Alva stayed with her. In response to a New York committee debating how best to rehabilitate courtesans, Alva wrote, "To ask what to do with the young courtesan is to begin in the wrong place. Arrest the men who create the need. Let their guilt fund the women they destroy." It wasn't maternal warmth. It was something fiercer, unvarnished justice. A woman once consumed by status, now advocating for the invisible and discarded. In 1913, Consuelo stood beside her at the International Woman Suffrage Alliance in Budapest, listening to Anna Shaw preach beneath vaulted ceilings. For the first time, their work felt shared, not staged, not rehearsed, but real. Then came war. She had booked passage on the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, set to sail on August 3rd, 1914. On August 2nd, the voyage was cancelled. Warnings rippled through the shipping lines. Routes changed. Neutral flags were hoisted higher. Submarines prowled familiar waters. 3 days later, she boarded a brightly lit American steamer. Other ships passed in darkness, their hulls scrubbed of identity. Her sons were still at Eton. Blandford, barely 17, had already been measured for war. The American Women's War Relief Fund asked her to serve. She said yes. Within months, she led the opening of hospitals in Devon and London. She organised committees, raised funds, and trained women to take up roles left vacant by enlisted men. When proposals arose, Mrs. Whitelaw Reid simply asked, "How much do you need?" and pledged it. By 1915, Sunderland House had become a meeting ground for the war's invisible architects. Her home for prisoners' wives became a maternity annex, 18 beds for unwed mothers, girls carrying more than shame. One of them wept beside her newborn. Her husband, a black American, had left for the front. The baby's pale skin terrified her. A nurse tried to reassure her. Newborns often look pale at birth. His colour will come. But the fear of judgment, abandonment, disbelief remained. In 1916, Consuelo gave the priestly lecture on infant mortality. She did not speak in abstractions. She began with a stark truth. 1 in every 8 children born in Britain dies before their first birthday. In London's poorest boroughs, the toll was worse. Disease ran rampant. Babies were wrapped in newspaper for warmth. Clinics turned away the unmarried. And Consuelo named what others would not: venereal disease, malnutrition, shame. Some in the audience stood and left. The Times called her brave. She launched the Jewel Fund. Give a jewel to save a baby's life. Cartier opened its vaults. Tiaras, tin lockets, wedding bands, Lloyd George's scarf pins sold twice. £50,000 poured in. But money, she learned, was never enough. For every maternity bed she opened, 10 more were needed. For every child she saved, another slipped through the cracks. Charity could soothe but not cure, and the disease was structural. Policies that punished, laws that excluded, lives made invisible. If she wanted to change the rules, she'd need to sit in the room where the rules were written. Politics came next. The major parties offered women no real seat. So she helped found the Women's Municipal Party. No whip, no machine, just women. Widowed, titled, determined. Tired of waiting for someone else's permission, Alva urged her forward. Not as ornament, she said, but as instrument. In 1917, Consuelo ran for London County Council in North Southwark. They deliberated, then chose her. She won again in 1919. Children sang in the streets. Vote, vote, vote for Mrs. Marlborough. Inside the council, she worked on housing, heat, education. She walked the slums and invited the Prince of Wales to join her. He did. "I wish my mother wore hats like yours," he said. But he listened. A disgruntled driver, dismissed for poor performance, began spreading rumours that she owned slum tenements. It was a lie, but damaging. She answered it quietly. No denials, no scandal, just a tram ride to her next public meeting, refusing to stand above those she served. One night, she noticed a man trailing her down a darkened street. Her heart pounded. Her pace quickened. So did his. But at her next gathering, when she rose to speak, he stood at the back and applauded. A supporter, it turned out. He had only wanted to ensure she got home safe. Even courage, it seemed, could be mistaken for risk. "You realise," Winston Churchill told her over lunch at the Savoy, "that you're the first American to sit on a British governing body since we rather rudely ejected your lot in 1776. "Not rudely," she smiled. "Justifiably." "Careful, cousin," he winked. "That's treasonous talk." "Only if you still consider me British," she replied. "I'm becoming more American every day." "Nonsense," he grinned. "We'll keep the good ones." Sunderland House had grown cold. No heat, no privacy. 10 housemaids quit. One muttered on her way out, "I thought this was a house. It's a town hall." In 1918, she handed it over. The Inter-Allied Council took possession. Arthur Balfour sent thanks. Paul Cravath took her rooms. Her sons were scattered across the front. Blandford rode with the cavalry in France. Ivor, barred from combat, served in logistics. Her brothers crossed the Atlantic in navy blue. She wrote them all daily, faithfully, never knowing which letter might be the last. Crowhurst took in wounded officers. Its halls echoed with crutches, coughs, and quiet grief. Her parlour became a ward. Her garden a vegetable patch. On November 11th, 1918, the siren sounded across London, not in warning, but in wonder. Peace. She stood on the balcony of the County Council building and looked out on a city that had bled for 4 years. Crowds surged, flags unfurled. The air trembled with hymns, with joy, with release. Then the French marched past, shrunken in number, solemn in step. She did not cheer. She wept for Paris, for Verdun, for the boys who did not return, and for the world they left behind. Peace brought no rest. The headlines shifted. The sirens fell silent, but the broken world remained. Slums still festered. Mothers still begged for blankets. Laws still lagged behind the lives they governed. Exhausted in body and spirit, Consuelo withdrew to Alva's villa among citrus groves and Mediterranean light. Alva was older now, slower, but no less certain. They sat in the garden, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing letters and wounds. Years of distance and dominance softened into something like tenderness, and in that quiet reconciliation, Consuelo allowed herself, finally, to rest. In 1920, Blandford married Lady Mary Cadogan, daughter of the 5th Earl Cadogan. The wedding took place at St Margaret's, Westminster, beneath a pale winter sun. The pews were filled with titled names and the shattered remnants of a generation. Consuelo watched her son, the future Duke, stand at the altar, polished, poised, and heartbreakingly young. She blessed the match, but as Mary took her son's arm, a shadow passed, faint, familiar. A girl in white, a door quietly closing. Then came the letter. It arrived in 1921. Brief, elegant, predictable. Sonny wanted a divorce. Gladys would not be a mistress. She would be a duchess. There was no courtroom scene, no scandal in the papers. The divorce was quietly obtained in Paris. Mutual consent, no accusations, no counterclaims. The headlines were courteous. Duke and Duchess part amicably. She moved to a smaller house with ivy on the walls and sunlight in the kitchen. No staff waited in doorways. No footman flanked the stairs. She learned to make her own tea. She sat by the fire in her slippers. And one morning she realized she had not heard her name announced in weeks, and no one had bowed. No one had asked her to smile. No one had called her the Duchess of Marlborough. They had called her Consuelo. Sonny married Gladys Deacon that summer. There was no church wedding, no photographs, just a line in the Times. She read it once, then went for a walk. The sun was warm. The air carried the smell of wet grass and stone. And for the first time in decades, she walked with no destination, no duty, no script. She had been traded for a title. Now she had given it back, and she did not miss it. Unlike your warm, cozy bed now, where you make your own choices, she had spent most of her life living by others' rules, smiling when told, speaking when permitted. But now, at last, she was beginning to find the one thing that had eluded her from the start: freedom. 1920 was shadowed by sorrow. Her father, gravely ill, died with quiet dignity. Consuelo was with him to the end. He bore his suffering without complaint, and when the Duc de Gramont sent condolences on behalf of the French Jockey Club, his words were simple: his death will be a great loss to the French racing world. Letters arrived from every corner. Aristocrats, jockeys, stable hands, surgeons. The Paris clinic he had funded mourned deeply. Consuelo had often helped there alongside her stepmother. Now she helped plan the burial. He was laid to rest in the family vault on Staten Island. In the house, where once children had peered down on balls from the upstairs gallery, hymns now echoed through closed doors. She spent long, still weeks in her mother's medieval-style home on Long Island. Alva had helped win the vote. She had become president of the National Woman's Party. But she was alone. Consuelo prepared to begin again. She sold Sunderland House, gave Portman Square to her son, released Crowhurst. Each home carried its own memory, each farewell its own grief. But she knew it was time. Her sons were grown, Blandford happily married, Ivor studying at Oxford. She had given them stability. Now she needed freedom. She moved into the Paris house her father had given her, but his death had ended the companionship she had hoped for. Alva joined her there, and with her Aunt Jenny, they built something soft and quiet. Waiting for the final steps of divorce, Consuelo leased a villa near Aza. She travelled often to England, but did not expect to fall in love. On July 4th, 1921, she married Jacques Balsan in the Chapel Royal of the Savoy at 9 a.m. to avoid reporters. This was quieter, warmer. They followed with a civil ceremony. Colonel George Harvey, American ambassador, and General Cornelius Vanderbilt stood as witnesses. There was no coronet, no throne, but there was peace. Jacques Balsan was beloved everywhere. Kind, clever, brave. Children loved him. So did generals, gardeners, and grand dames. He was, she realised, not a man who needed to impress, but one who knew how to care. Jacques was a pilot, but before planes, he flew balloons. In 1899, he floated from France to Russia, crashing in Prussia and landing at the estate of Baron von Bandemer. He was greeted politely, shown a monument to the French defeat at Sedan, and sent on his way. He bought his first airplane in 1909 and earned pilot licence number 18. In Morocco, he flew reconnaissance against the Moors, risking capture and torture. In 1913, he received the Legion of Honour. In World War I, he scouted during the First Battle of the Marne. Later, with Consuelo's father and Dr. Gros, he helped establish the Lafayette Escadrille, precursor to the American Air Force. They had met years before when she was still a newlywed and he a dashing guest at Blenheim. During the war, he had once sent her a postcard before a bombing run. I did not expect to return. Now he had. Unlike the Duke, who saw her as an ornament, Jacques saw her as a partner. What would you like to do? He asked her one morning over breakfast, a question so simple yet so revolutionary that she nearly dropped her cup. Do? She repeated. Yes, he smiled. With your life, with our life. What would you like to create? No one, not her mother, not her ex-husband, not society, had ever asked. She thought for a moment, then smiled back. Everything. Their marriage was not recognised by the Catholic Church. In France, where Catholicism ruled society, divorce was rare and remarriage without annulment forbidden. Jacques' family, devout and bound to tradition, could not receive her. She asked him not to break with them. She would wait. When in 1926 Marlborough sought his own annulment, the moment came. With the help of her mother and old governess, she petitioned Rome. Her lawyer, Sir Charles Russell, warned that only proof of coercion would suffice. Alva consented as a way to apologise for that action so long ago. She admitted she had forced her daughter unwillingly to marry. The Vatican ruled in Consuelo's favour. No bribes had passed, only courage and truth. Now married in the church, Consuelo was welcomed into the Balsan family. At the chateau in Chaumet, once established by the Prince de Condé, she met them all. Madame Charles Balsan, Jacques' great-aunt, presided in lace and black. She offered Consuelo a golden heirloom box. "We loved him too," she seemed to say. "And now we love you." Later, Consuelo wrote her a letter of thanks. The matriarch read it aloud to the family. It was, she recalled, a moment of true reconciliation. In Paris, she and Jacques made their home near the green lawns of the Champ de Mars. From her window, she watched cavalry officers trot by at dawn. Children played, readers claimed benches. The Seine shimmered, the Eiffel Tower blinked its message to the sky. Their house, designed in 18th century style, was filled with antiques and discoveries from long walks along the quay. Paris life was elegance, but not idleness. Consuelo hosted modest luncheons with literary guests. Edith Wharton visited frequently. She chaired charity events. The British Embassy, once owned by Pauline Borghese, held glittering dinners under Napoleon's gold service. Here, old castes mingled. Bourbon, Bonaparte, Republican. She watched it all with grace and growing understanding. "You know what's strange?" she said to Jacques one evening as they returned from a salon hosted by the Comtesse de Noailles. "I used to think being a duchess was the height of power, but I had no power at all. And now?" he asked, helping her with her coat. "Now I have the only power that matters," she smiled. "The power to choose." In 1926, she was asked to help build a hospital for the middle class, those too proud for charity, too poor for private care. The hilltop site near Suresnes had once belonged to Jean Worth. With Dr. Alexis Carrel and Bernard Flexner, she led the campaign. 360 rooms and a nursing school. Fundraising became fate. Grand Prix dinners, peacock balls, raffles with Fabergé clocks. Musicians clamoured to perform. "I was at your benefit concert," an elderly man in worn clothes told her one afternoon as she inspected the hospital's foundation stones. 40 years ago, I cleaned the stables at Blenheim. You probably don't remember me." She studied his face, weathered like bark. "You're wrong, Mr. Harrison. You had a border collie named Pitch who followed you everywhere." The man's eyes widened. "You remember that?" "I remember everyone who was kind to me," she said. "You let me feed Pitch when no one was looking." He nodded, suddenly shy. "This place you're building, my daughter's expecting her first. They live in 2 rooms, no proper doctor for miles." "She'll have a room here," Consuelo said, touching his arm. "The best care we can give." "Why, though?" he asked. "Why go to all this trouble for people you don't know?" She looked out over the construction site, the men laying foundations in the afternoon sun. "Because I spent half my life as decoration," she said. "I'd rather spend the rest being useful." For many, a Gilded Age socialite possessing a luxurious Parisian mansion and a villa on the Riviera might be more than sufficient. As a former duchess and Vanderbilt heiress, Consuelo was not your garden variety Gilded Age socialite. Having relocated to France, she needed a country place within easy reach of Paris. To that end, in 1922, Jacques and Consuelo purchased and restored Château Saint-Georges Motel, an early 17th century manor near Dreux in Normandy. The chateau was a resurrection project. Neglected for decades, its roof leaked. Its gardens had surrendered to wilderness. Its windows stared blankly into nothing. "It's a disaster," the real estate agent warned. "Completely uninhabitable." Jacques laughed. So was Blenheim, and they called that a palace. They worked side by side, hiring local craftsmen, sourcing materials, replanting the gardens. Unlike Blenheim, with its armies of servants and rigid protocols, St. George